Greetings, my dear friends, and welcome to another episode of Reading Epic Threads. I'm your host, Patrick Gunnels, joining you from Houston, Texas, this March 7th, 2025 at 9:44 a.m. Central Standard Time. Standard Time comes to an end in less than 2 days, less than 48 hours. And my wife and I will both be complaining about it because it is absolute bullcrap. I am producing this live for all of my wonderful viewers at readingepicthreads.substack.com. For the rest of you, this is recorded, which comes on at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central every single day, as long as I don't forget. And then when it comes on readingepicthreads.substack.com is live with variable times. And that's just, it's kind of how I roll. Guys, go ahead and go to tulipblooms.shop and check out the Youthful Trio Serum. They are currently on discount. We have the vitamin C serum, the castor blend, and the nighttime serum. If I have it wrong, I apologize. I think I have it right. No, the vitamin C serum is for nighttime, and there's something else for the morning dew refreshing serum plus castor blend. All three of those together at a big collective discount. Check it out at tulipblooms.shop, promo code Shapiro for 10% off. All righty. I'm going to start with James Delingpole, and the piece is called Who Really Runs the World? From Delingpole.substack.com. Who really runs the world? Clue. They all follow the old religion. By James Delingpole. One of the things I didn't want to discover when I first started venturing down the rabbit hole was that the Jews might be responsible for everything bad in the world. This was partly for cowardice reasons. No one wants to be canceled. Being labeled anti-Semitic is, for some odd reason, the world's most cancelable offense. But mainly it was for personal reasons. How would my Jewish friends feel if I suddenly decided they were all part of some sinister conspiracy? I do hate to play some of my best friends are Jewish, black, gay, trans, whatever, because I know it's part of the enemy's trap, designed to lure us into the dangerous and divisive idiocy that there are categories of people out there with protected minority status that ought to earn them special privileges. Nevertheless, it's an inescapable fact that some of my favorite people from my past, raffish uncles by marriage, generous benefactors, witty, loyal, and well-loved friends, mentors, adorable podcast guests, etc., do happen to be of a Jewish persuasion, and I continue to love them as much as I did and would hate to cause them any upset. That said, I'm on a mission. Since becoming a conspiracy theorist and a fully fledged Christian almost simultaneously, I have come to realize that the truth is just about the most precious commodity we have. And the truth shall make you free, said our Lord. And as ever, he was on the money. Truth is pure. Truth is absolute. Truth is divine. Truth does not come with special provisos and get-out clauses which permit you to shirk it under certain circumstances, like, say, some people might find it offensive, or some races get a free pass because of historical persecution, so you can't criticize them even if what you say is true. What I'm saying here is that I'll go wherever the truth takes me, even if it means getting myself into hot water. When eventually I get to the bottom of the rabbit hole, I discover a big sign saying, yup, it's the Jews, sorry. I'm not going to paint it over lest it get me into trouble or make a few people upset. Nor, though, am I going to join the It's the Jews club unless I find more compelling evidence than I have so far. My main difficulty with the It's the Jews theory is the timeline. Most of the world's Jews, which is a fake term anyway, probably no older than a 14th century mistranslation of the Vulgate Bible by John Wycliffe, are descended from the pagan Khanate of Khazaria, which mass converted to Judaism in the 9th or 10th century. I'm not going to suggest that the Khazarians, brigands, name stealers into child sacrifice, weren't horrible, devious people. They're likely descended from the Edomites, whom God found so abominable, he wished them to be wiped out of existence. But it still seems to me a bit of a stretch to believe that a bunch of goat shaggers from what is now Ukraine could, in the space of just a millennium, go on to infiltrate and displace all the ancient power structures that existed prior to their appearance on the scene. What about the black nobility, for example, who can trace their lineage at least as far back as ancient Rome? Where do the 13 satanic bloodline families fit in? What about the gray, black, and white popes? And whither the Phoenician navy? Each of these factions has its champions in conspiracy circles. No, it's the Jesuits, is one of the more fashionable arguments, but I don't believe it's that simple. Rather, I think we need to think of them all as competing crime families, united by a common cause, doing evil, and all ultimately answerable to the capo di tutti di capi. The capo over all the other capos, I think is what that means. That capo di tutti I capi, as John tells us 3 times in his gospel, is the devil himself, the prince of the world. Non-Christian readers might differ on this one, but to me, the Christian explanation makes perfect sense. God has granted the devil temporary permission to rule the world as the price we must pay for free will. If we didn't have free will, we'd still be prancing naked around the Garden of Eden, which would be lovely, except that we'd be like NPCs in a video game. Now that we're cast out of Eden, we get to be heroes who decide our own adventure, but our path is fraught with temptations designed by the devil to lure us astray, which is what makes doing the right thing more challenging and ultimately more rewarding. In the end, Christ returns and God wins. But the families who run the world, Satan's minions, prefer to overlook this inconvenient truth and to focus on the more immediate, viz. If you suck up to the current chief executive, you're given all manner of perks, what the ruling class understands and most normies don't, despite all the massive clues they were given in the satanic revelation of the method series Harry Potter, is that magic does actually work. If you perform the right rituals, commit yourself to evil, seeking constantly to thwart God's will, then Satan and his demonic forces can reward you with all manner of earthly riches. This has been known to the ruling elites since at least the era of Babylon, whence much occult tradition, the Babylonian mystery religions, emanates. So far, it has worked very well for them, which is why they've managed to amass all that intergenerational wealth and why they are generally so reluctant to marry outside their traditions. They want to keep it all in the family, within the bloodlines. If you find this sort of thing interesting, and how could you not, then I highly recommend you check out immediately the podcast I've just recorded with Tobias Nuttall from February 28th at dellingpole.substack.com, the Delling Pod. Tobias Nuttall is the co-host of the Waking World podcast. Of course, I love all my children equally, but I have to admit that this is among my favorite podcast chats, because Tobias, despite being Australian and briefly a former member of Aleister Crowley's deeply dodgy Ordo Templi Orientis cult, is very much a man after my own heart. Excitable, irreverent, slightly silly, but clever, really. Well-read, relentlessly curious, determined to get the bottom of everything, even if he ends up being killed trying. In the course of our meandering conversation, Nuttall provides some useful pointers towards how the system works. These are partly gleaned from an encounter described in more detail in this Waking World podcast episode, link in the article, with an upper-class Englishman whom he met hiding out in a remote part of Australia and whom he believes to be connected to one of the Illuminati bloodlines families. Of course, you can never be sure with these inside the Illuminati whistleblowing types, whether they are for real or whether they're just bullshitting. It's a bit like special forces. For every person you've ever met who has actually been in the SAS, there's another half dozen who claims to have been, but wasn't. So, how can you be sure what they're telling you is true? Well, you can't. Obviously, you can't. The nature of secret societies, especially the higher up the ladder you go, is that their inner workings tend to remain quite opaque, not least because there are dread penalties for those who spill the beans. But that doesn't mean that over the centuries, sufficient information hasn't leaked out one way or another for us curious non-Illuminati types to have been able to construct a reasonably accurate picture. So when a new person speaks out, like this Illuminati adjacent Englishman in the outback, you can set his claims against what you know already and judge accordingly. The comment from the Illuminati adjacent Englishman that most struck a chord with me was when he said something to this effect: if you're not bloodlines, you're never going to get anywhere. They're just not interested in you. Even if he's just relaying high-level gossip he heard, I think he's on the money here. We all know about the nuances of the English class system with all the various subtle traps laid to catch out the unwary, such as how to pronounce surnames like Cholmondeley, whether you put your milk into your tea first, what kind of dog you own, etc. Americans have their own version. But though these stratified systems are sold to us as pure snobbery, I think this is a handy cover story which conceals something much more sinister. I'm not saying the snobbery isn't real and deeply felt and instinctive. It is. But the reason it has been nurtured and developed over time is because it ingrains in people of the right caste the vital importance of keeping outsiders out. And why would that be so necessary? Because of the other most revealing thing the Illuminati adjacent Englishman said, that the old families are mostly practitioners of what they call the old religion. This is a euphemism for those occult practices dating at least back to Babylon. Officially and publicly, these families may identify as Catholics, Mormons, Baptists, Jews, or even atheists, but behind the scenes, they observe the same barbaric pagan rites, up to and including sacrifice of the firstborn, which God repeatedly rails against in the Old Testament because they are an affront to his creation and because they deify his enemies, led by the fallen rebel angel Lucifer. Oh, by the way, when we have a first child, we will, of course, be expected to sacrifice it to Satan so we can keep the grouse moor, the home in the Hamptons, the shack on Martinique. Is a tough sell to a prospective wife or husband who wasn't born into the tradition. That's why these bloodline families prefer to intermingle with other bloodline families where everyone knows the score and where everyone can be relied upon to serve the same master, and no one is going to do anything so foolish as squeal about the family's secrets. Obviously, some of the families I describe here will have Jewish surnames, but in terms of the world's Jewish population, we're talking probably less than the richest 1% of the richest 1%. I doubt very much that any of the Jews that I know or you know are secretly worshiping Satan. They just happen in the lottery of life to have been born to a woman whose mother was also Jewish. They're no more responsible for what the evil rulers of the world do to us than say, I am just because I happen to have been to university with some of these evil rulers and possibly met them at the occasional house weekend. Now that I am properly down the rabbit hole, I think I have a much better idea of what F. Scott Fitzgerald meant when he said that the very rich are different from you and me. It's not so much that they have more money than they know what to do with. Rather, it's that deadness of the soul, which comes from belonging to a caste whose membership requirements include setting yourself in opposition to God. These people can be witty company, generous hosts, even give you the illusion of having a degree of intimacy with them. But there's a divide between them and you that you're never going to be able to cross. And just occasionally, in their rare, unguarded moments, you see it. What it is, you realize, is that they don't consider you to be fully human. They might appreciate you as an engaging plaything, or an amusing conversationalist, or an agreeable pheasant shooting companion, or an invaluable source of girly gossip. But they'll never view you as an equal, because you're not one of them. You haven't been through the personality-shattering, ritualized sexual abuse they had to experience as a routine part of their upbringing. You're not privy to the secrets of the occult, which grant them their money and power. You might even have been fooled by all that childish nonsense about Jesus being your savior and God being the good guy. Again, J.K. Rowling is your guide here. The bloodline families view us a bit like the magical families in Harry Potter view the Muggles, with a superior air of puzzlement, amusement, and light disdain. In some ways, you can't blame them for thinking as they do. Not only has it been beaten into them over generations, but also they only have to look around themselves at their magnificent homes, their fancy cars, their island retreats, to be reassured that the old religion is the way to go. In fact, all the evidence has shown over the centuries it enables them, continually, to get away with murder. They are like the ungodly in Psalm 73, who gloat that they can defy God's will with impunity. Tush, they say, how should God perceive it? Is there knowledge in the Most High? Spoiler alert, it doesn't end well for them according to the psalm. Oh, how suddenly do they consume, perish, and come to a fearful end. Couldn't happen to nicer people. Check him out at dellingpole.substack.com, dellingpole.substack.com. I've had my divergences from Herr Dellingpole on a whole bunch of different issues, the largest of which being Donald Trump, whom I still regard as the greatest president that we've ever had, and certainly working against the enemy. I can't wait to replace this computer, y'all. It's going to be amazing when I do. All right. You know what? I'm just going to close Facebook on my computer. I've had enough. All right. The next piece we're going to do is an original from Patrick Gunnels at readingepicthreads.substack.com. And the piece is entitled I don't like the fact that I can't, on Substack, I can't sort by whether or not I want to just read articles or podcasts or whatever. It sucks. I have to search every time. So I'll just type XRP because I think it's the SEC case. Yeah, the SEC's war on XRP. So I just want to view the post. There we go. All right. Wow. It feels a lot longer when you're writing it, but it's not that long. This is an original piece by me entitled The SEC's War on XRP from readingepicthreads.substack.com. Crypto was supposed to be a revolution, a way to break the grip of centralized financial power and return control to the individual. Instead, We find ourselves mired in tribalism, regulatory capture, and corruption so brazen it would make a 19th century railroad tycoon blush. Nowhere is this more evident than in the SEC's calculated assault on XRP, a digital asset that threatened both entrenched financial interests and the Ethereum first status quo. For years, Bitcoin maximalists have regurgitated the demonstrable falsehood that Ripple controls the XRP ledger, dismissing XRP as nothing more than a banker's coin. This propaganda campaign has dissuaded countless crypto newcomers from even considering XRP, despite its clear advantages in speed, efficiency, and scalability. While the maximalists wallowed in ignorance, the SEC took their fabrications and used them as the pretext for a legal assault on Ripple that had nothing to do with investor protection and everything to do with ensuring Ethereum's regulatory dominance. This is not a story of free markets or fair competition. This is a story of regulatory corruption, conflicts of interest, and outright criminality at the highest levels of the SEC. XRP derangement syndrome, the big lie. There is an affliction plaguing certain corners of the crypto world that can only be described as XRP derangement syndrome, XDS. It manifests as an involuntary, almost pathological reaction to the mere mention of XRP, leading otherwise rational individuals to insist, against all evidence, that Ripple controls the XRP ledger. The reality is plain. The XRP ledger is decentralized. It operates on a consensus protocol governed by over 120 independent validators, of which Ripple runs only a handful. To test the network's resilience, Ripple voluntarily stopped running its validator, and the ledger continued processing transactions without issue. Bitcoin, on the other hand, is functionally controlled by a handful of core developers, and its network security is in the hands of a mining cartel that has at various points controlled over 50% of the network's hash rate. The hypocrisy of Bitcoin maximalists is predictable and tedious. While they parrot the lie that XRP is centralized, they turn a blind eye to Bitcoin's obvious governance issues, where an unelected handful dictates the protocol's direction, resistant even to minor improvements. But maximalists are not the real culprits here. They are merely the unwitting pawns in a much larger game, one orchestrated by SEC officials who leveraged these lies to attack Ripple while giving Ethereum a free pass. The Ethereum free pass and the SEC's hit job on Ripple. The turning point in this saga occurred on June 14th, 2018, when William Hinman, then director of the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance, delivered a speech at the Yahoo Finance All Markets Summit. In that speech, Hinman declared Ethereum was not a security. Quote, "Based on my understanding of the present state of Ether, the Ethereum network, and its decentralized structure, current offers and sales of Ether are not securities transactions." End quote. That single statement sent Ethereum's price surging and established it as the dominant smart contract platform. Meanwhile, XRP was left with no regulatory clarity despite being in operation for years without issue. But what the public did not yet know was that Hinman had a direct financial interest in Ethereum's success. At the time of his speech, Hinman was still receiving payments from Simpson, Thacher, and Bartlett LLP, a law firm deeply embedded in the enterprise Ethereum alliance. Internal SEC emails later revealed that multiple SEC officials explicitly warned Hinman against making a regulatory declaration in his speech, stating that such a decision lacked legal foundation and could create market confusion. One email, dated June 12th, 2018, just 2 days before the speech, reads, quote, "Bill, this speech makes a direct regulatory determination. Are we comfortable making such a statement absent an official SEC ruling?" End quote. Hinman ignored these warnings and proceeded anyway. Less than 2 years later, he left the SEC and returned to Simpson Thacher, where he cashed in on the very regulatory favoritism he granted Ethereum. If this is not a textbook case of regulatory capture, then the term has lost all meaning. Jay Clayton's parting shot at XRP. If Hinman's Ethereum speech secured Ethereum's regulatory clarity, Jay Clayton's final act as SEC chairman ensured that XRP would be crushed. On December 22nd, 2020, Clayton filed the SEC's lawsuit against Ripple on his last day in office, alleging that XRP was an unregistered security. The timing was no accident. The lawsuit immediately tanked XRP's price by over 50%, prompting exchanges to delist it en masse, crippling liquidity and forcing Ripple into a protracted legal battle. Meanwhile, Ethereum's price soared, reaching new all-time highs in the months that followed. And where did Clayton land after leaving the SEC? Directly at Sullivan and Cromwell LLP, a law firm deeply involved with ConsenSys, Ethereum's primary corporate backer. This is not speculation. This is a matter of public record. Ethereum insiders secured regulatory clarity through a speech written by a man receiving payments from Ethereum-linked financial interests, while Ripple was systematically excluded from the conversation before being ambushed with a lawsuit on the SEC chairman's last day in office. This was not regulation. This was a coordinated financial attack. This was a crime, and there should be prosecutions. This was not mere incompetence. This was criminal. The individuals responsible should not only be removed from any position of influence, but they should also face prison time. William Hinman's actions fall squarely within the scope of Chapter 18, United States Code Section 201, which prohibits public officials from using their office for personal financial gain. The penalty, up to 15 years in federal prison. Jay Clayton's maneuvering, in which he weaponized an SEC lawsuit to cripple a competitor while transitioning directly to a law firm that benefited from Ethereum's rise, is a clear violation of Chapter 18, United States Code, Section 371, conspiracy to defraud the United States, a 5-year felony. The SEC's systematic targeting of XRP while promoting Ethereum meets the definition of honest services fraud under Chapter 18, United States Code, Section 1346, an offense carrying a maximum sentence of 20 years. Finally, the sheer coordinated nature of this operation meets the legal threshold for racketeering under Chapter 18, United States Code, Section 1962, RICO. This was not a random collection of bad decisions. This was a sustained criminal conspiracy to pick winners and losers in crypto. A full RICO prosecution should put Hinman, Clayton, and their enablers behind bars for 25 years or more. Bitcoin maximalists cheered as the SEC attacked XRP, convinced they were witnessing the rightful purging of a shitcoin. But they failed to grasp what was actually happening. This was not an attack on XRP alone. This was an attack on the very idea of crypto as an open market. The SEC's actions were not about protecting investors. They were about ensuring that Ethereum was granted regulatory certainty while its competitors were crushed. And if the maximalists think regulators will stop at XRP, they are in for a rude awakening. Crypto does not need maximalism. Maximalism is a cancer that stifles innovation, divides the industry, and makes it easier for bad actors like the SEC to manipulate the market. If we do not unite against regulatory overreach, the entire crypto industry will be captured, controlled, and neutered, just as the SEC tried to do to XRP. The fight is not over, but now we know who the real enemy is. And they belong in prison. And that's my little spirit being raised. I'm trying to raise your spirit. Oops. All right. UPS just tried to deliver a package to me, and I was in here doing my job. It must be a really valuable package, because normally they wouldn't insist upon delivering it to me. And it must be a computer component. Okay, so now that was readingepicthreads.substack.com. I do the occasional original piece. I don't know how people write the super long pieces, because that piece took forever for me to write. All right, let's go to mikestone.substack.com, and I want to talk about the germ hypothesis. And don't forget, guys, go to tulipblooms.shop. That's tulipblooms.shop. Get the amazing castor blend, and you can get it in a 3-pack with 2 other serums: the vitamin C serum for nighttime and the refreshing morning dew for morning time, and castor blend for freaking all the time. Get all 3 of them. Big collective discount on those. Get them at tulipblooms.shop. Promo code Shapiro for an extra 10% off. You know you wanna. You know you wanna. All right. I'm watching myself on camera on my smartphone, and I look much more tan, and on my screen on my computer I look red. I don't know what to say about that. All right, let's keep going. This is from my friend Mike Stone. So go to mikestone.substack.com. Tell them that Reading Epic Threads sent you. That'd be really great. I want to be on his leaderboard of referrers. Right now, I'm like number 10. The germ hypothesis, part 1. Pasteur's problems. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the germ theory of disease, which states that certain diseases are caused by the invasion of the body by microorganisms too small to be seen, has, quote, long been considered proved. Harvard University says that the theory was, quote, developed, proved, and popularized in Europe and North America between about 1850 and 1920. Wikipedia claims that the germ theory of disease is the currently accepted scientific theory for many diseases. Papers published in scientific journals claim that Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch firmly established the germ theory of disease, and that they first proved the germ theory of disease in the second half of the 19th century. Thus, if we were to listen to what the mainstream sources declare, it would appear that the germ theory of disease has been scientifically proven based upon the evidence established by Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. We are to believe that the work of these 2 men allowed for the initial germ hypothesis to be proven in order to be elevated to the status of a scientific theory. But is that truly the case? Did Pasteur and Koch provide the necessary scientific evidence required to confirm the germ hypothesis? What does it take to accept or reject a hypothesis? How does a hypothesis go on to become a scientific theory? In the first of a 2-part examination of the germ hypothesis, looking at the work of both men, we will begin by inspecting 2 of Pasteur's early attempts to prove his hypothesis in the cases of chicken cholera and rabies. We will investigate how he arrived at his germ hypothesis and then look to see if his experimental evidence reflected anything that could be witnessed in nature. In doing so, we will find out whether or not Louis Pasteur was ever able to validate and confirm his germ hypothesis. What is hypothesis? It's an educated prediction that provides an explanation for observed events, a tentative statement, a testable prediction about what you expect to happen in a study. Key point: observed events and tentative. An observed event, a measurable result or condition, tentative, yet to be confirmed. To begin this investigation, we need to understand what exactly a hypothesis is supposed to be. Returning to the Britannica for a moment, a scientific hypothesis is defined as, quote, an idea that proposes a tentative explanation about a phenomenon or narrow set of phenomena observed in the natural world. Stated another way, a hypothesis is an explanation based upon and about an observed natural phenomenon. However, what exactly is a natural phenomenon in relation to natural science? According to the Next Generation Science Standards, NGSS, a natural phenomenon is defined as, quote, observable events that occur in the universe and that we can use our science knowledge to explain or predict. This definition by the NGSS was developed from a 26-state effort that created new education standards in science in collaboration with the National Science Teachers Association, NSTA, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, the National Research Council, NRC, and the nonprofit organization Achieve. Supporting the NGSS definition of natural phenomena as being observable events are various philosophers of science, such as Ian Hacking, considered the first to define phenomena from science perspective, who stated that a phenomenon is, quote, commonly an event or process of a certain type that occurs regularly under definite circumstances. The word can also denote a unique event that we single out as particularly important, end quote. Michela Massimi, another philosopher of science, agreed with Hacking in her book Perspectival Realism, stating that, quote, phenomena are events. They are not things, entities, structures, facts, or states of affairs, end quote. Thus, from these definitions, we can narrow down natural phenomena to observable events or processes. Nonetheless, not just any event will do. In order for a phenomenon to be natural, these events must occur in nature without human influence and interference. In other words, the events are not man-made. If these conditions are met and a natural phenomenon is observed, a proposed explanation can be formulated in order to describe what might be occurring. The Britannica goes on to state that two very important and primary features of a scientific hypothesis are falsifiability and testability. Falsifiability means that the hypothesis is stated in such a way that there is some capacity to be able to prove the hypothesis wrong through experimentation. This idea was introduced by scientific philosopher Karl Popper in 1935 in his book, The Logic of Scientific Discovery. According to this concept, someone should be able conceivably to design an experiment that could prove the hypothesis wrong. If a hypothesis is capable of being proven wrong, and yet it is supported by experimental evidence of its truth, then it can be considered as a scientific hypothesis. A falsifiable hypothesis should be formulated as an if-then statement that summarizes the idea established from the phenomenon, and it must have testability, meaning that it can then be supported or refuted through experimentation. The observation of a natural phenomenon and the creation of a falsifiable and testable hypothesis is the first part of the scientific method, as noted in Chapter 2, Science as a Way of Understanding the Natural World, of the book Environmental Science. A quote from the book. The scientific method begins with the identification of a question involving the structure or function of the natural world, which is usually developed using inductive logic. The question is interpreted in terms of existing theory, and specific hypotheses are formulated to explain the character and causes of the natural phenomenon. In contrast, a hypothesis is a proposed explanation for the occurrence of a phenomenon. Scientists formulate hypotheses as statements and then test them through experiments and other forms of research. Hypotheses are developed using logic, inference, and mathematical arguments in order to explain observed phenomena. End quote. According to Elsevier, a Dutch academic publishing company specializing in scientific, technical, and medical content, without a hypothesis, there can be no basis for a scientific experiment. We can, therefore, conclude that the hypothesis is crucial to obtaining scientific evidence. They state that the hypothesis is a prediction of the relationship that exists between two or more variables. What this means is that a hypothesis must be designed and written in such a way as to prove whether or not a predicted relationship derived from the natural phenomenon exists between two variables: the independent variable, the presumed cause, and the dependent variable, the observed effect. This is usually then stated as the null hypothesis, which predicts that there is no relationship between the variables, and as the alternative hypothesis, which predicts that there is a relationship between the variables. Once the hypothesis has been established, a proper experiment can be designed in order to test it. According to American philosopher and historian of science Peter Machemer, in his 2009 paper Phenomena, Data and Theories, a special issue of Synthese, the experiment should show us something important that occurs within the real world. The goal is to ensure that the aspects of the observed natural phenomenon that originally sparked the hypothesis are caught in the design of the experiment. In this way, the experiment will be able to tell us something about the world and the phenomena studied. Thus, it is critical that the hypothesis is tested properly through an experimental design that accurately reflects the observed natural phenomenon and what is seen in nature. Quote, does the experiment actually show us something important about what is going on in the real world that lies outside of the experimental setting? One form of this worry is gleaned by making a distinction between phenomena and artifacts. See Feast 2003, 2005, 2008. This problem arises when operationalizing a phenomenon so it may be experimentally investigated in a laboratory or other non-natural setting. Basically, we want to make sure that when we create an experimental design, we are reasonably sure that we are catching the aspects of the phenomenon that originally sparked our interest or which we were seeking to explain. We want our experiments to tell us something about the world, about the phenomenon. When we design experiments, we try to simplify situations so that we may control the relevant variables, which will then allow us to intervene and observe what happens as a result of the intervention. We design experiments to generate data, which then may be used to tell us something about the world or how the world is or how it works. But often, we know something about the phenomenon of interest before setting up the experiment. End quote. If the hypothesis is tested correctly through proper experimental design via the scientific method, and repeated testing strengthens the correlation between two or more things happening in association with each other, resulting in the observed natural phenomenon, the cause of a natural phenomenon can be proven. This would make it possible to determine the likelihood of the event happening again if the results are confirmed through replication and reproducibility by independent researchers. This gives the hypothesis predictive power once the predictions provided by the hypothesis are repeatedly confirmed through independent verification and validation by the scientific community. The hypothesis can then be elevated to a scientific theory. However, to get to the point of becoming a scientific theory, a hypothesis must be confirmed through accurate experimentation first, and it must not be falsified. This absolutely critical fact is seemingly something that was forgotten when the germ hypothesis was elevated to the status of a scientific theory. As Albert Einstein stated, no amount of experimentation can ever prove me right. A single experiment can prove me wrong. What does it say about the evidence supporting a hypothesis if the experiments designed reflecting the hypothesis failed and the evidence obtained that supports it was through experiments that were not designed properly and do not reflect the proposed explanation? If the experiments do not reflect the hypothesis that was derived from the observed natural phenomenon, can the knowledge acquired still be considered scientific knowledge that tells us anything truthful about what really occurs in nature? With these questions in mind, let's see if Louis Pasteur's hypotheses hold up under scrutiny. Creating the germ hypothesis. What is germ theory? As defined by the Encyclopedia Britannica, the germ theory of disease is the theory that certain diseases are caused by the invasion of the body by microorganisms. This is based on three basic underlying principles that developed throughout the history of medicine, described by John Waller in the discovery of the germ. 1, microbes can cause illnesses within the body. 2, microbes and thus the illness can spread from one person to another. 3, a specific microbe exists for each illness, which will always invoke the same illness. According to French-American microbiologist René Dubos, the, quote, central dogma of the germ theory is that each particular type of fermentation or of disease is caused by a specific kind of microbe. While the idea that disease could be caused by invisible germs had been around since Girolamo Fracastoro published De Contagione e de Contagiosis Morbis in 1546, French chemist Louis Pasteur conjured up his own germ hypothesis in the early 1860s based upon his work on fermentation. Granted, Pasteur had largely plagiarized from the work of French chemist and physician Antoine Béchamp, which he subsequently misinterpreted, as Béchamp saw the microbes, which he referred to as microzymas or microzymas, performing a necessary and vital function by breaking down substances and tissues in order to carry away dead cells and other waste products. In other words, germs are nature's cleanup crew and are not the cause of disease. As he noted in The Blood and Its Third Anatomical Element, Béchamp viewed these processes as being born within all living things based upon the internal environment of the individual. Quote from Béchamp: the bacteriidae were not the cause of the diseased condition, but were one of its effects. Proceeding from the morbid microzymas, they were capable of inducing this diseased condition in the animal whose microzymas were in a condition to receive it. Hence, it is seen that the alteration of natural animal matters is spontaneous and justifies the old aphorism so concisely expressed by Pidou: diseases are born of us and in us. On the other hand, the disregard of this law of nature, the firm establishment whereof is completed by the present work, necessarily led Monsieur Pasteur to deny the truth of the aphorism and to imagine a pathogenic panspermy as he had before conceived a priori, that there was a panspermy of fermentations, that Monsieur Pasteur, after having been a sponteperist, should reach such a conclusion was natural enough. He was neither a physiologist nor physician, but only a chemist without any knowledge of comparative science. End quote. Pasteur, on the other hand, viewed the germs, such as yeasts, involved in the fermentation of sugar to produce alcohol, as well as other microbes responsible for putrefaction and the decay of tissues, as outside invaders. He proclaimed that the microbes, isolated from wounds and other degenerative tissues, were the cause of the destruction of the normal tissues, leading to disease. His views ran contrary to the popular notion at the time that microbes were the result of and not the cause of disease. Pasteur, along with a minority of other scientists, believed that diseases arose from the activities of these microorganisms, while opponents, such as Béchamp and German pathologist Rudolf Virchow, believed that diseases arose from an imbalance in the internal state of the afflicted individual. As noted by Béchamp, just as Pasteur had assumed that there was a specific microbe for each ferment, he did the same by assuming that this must hold true for human and animal diseases as well. However, there was a bit of a problem for the germ hypothesis, as Pasteur was unable ever to observe any germ infecting anyone in order to cause disease. The only natural phenomenon that he could observe were the signs and symptoms of disease, and he tried to correlate a tentative relationship between microbes and disease based upon finding microbes in wounds and diseased tissues. As we know, correlation does not equal causation. The fact that microbes are found on the body of a decaying animal does not mean that the microbes caused the animal to die. The microbes occur after the fact in order to perform a necessary function, in this case, decomposition. Rather than concluding that the microbes were present in wounds due to the need to heal the injury, Pasteur assumed that the microbes, which he claimed were present all around us within the air, became attracted to the wounds, taking advantage of the weakened state. With this a priori assumption in mind, Pasteur set out to create evidence to support his preconceived idea. Testing the germ hypothesis. Chicken cholera. While Pasteur had this idea of how diseases were caused by microorganisms as early as the 1860s, he didn't put his hypothesis to the test until the late 1870s. In an 1878 lecture, The Germ Theory and Its Applications to Medicine and Surgery, read before the French Academy of Sciences on April 29, 1878, Pasteur had already hypothesized that there was a virus, i.e., some form of chemical poison, as the word didn't mean an obligate intracellular parasite at that time, in the solutions of the bacterial cultures that he was working with. He then went on to claim that this poison would accumulate within the body of the animal as the bacteria grew. Interestingly, he then noted that his hypothesis presupposes the forming and necessary existence of the bacteria, thus admitting that his hypothesis was not based upon any observed natural phenomenon. Quote, "There is only one possible hypothesis as to the existence of a virus in solution, and that is that such a substance, which was present in our experiment in non-fatal amounts, should be continuously furnished by the vibrio itself during its growth in the body of the living animal. But it is of little importance, since the hypothesis supposes the forming and necessary existence of the vibrio." End quote. Regardless, Pasteur's attempts to prove his germ hypothesis began later that same year with his study into the fowl disease known as chicken cholera. According to Gerald Gasson's The Private Science of Louis Pasteur, in December of 1878, Pasteur was supplied some blood from a diseased chicken by Henri Toussaint, a French veterinarian who claimed to have cultured the responsible bacterium. However, another version states that Toussaint sent the heart of a guinea pig inoculated with the presumed germ of chicken cholera to Pasteur. Whatever the case, Pasteur immediately attempted isolating the microbe in a state of purity in order to demonstrate that it was the sole cause of chicken cholera. Upon doing so, he realized that the microbe developed more easily in neutral chicken broth than in the neutral urine that Toussaint utilized as his culture medium. While Pasteur thanked Toussaint, Gasson noted that he, quote, left little doubt that he considered Toussaint's work and techniques decidedly inferior to his own. Pasteur eventually claimed that he could make successive cultures of what he referred to as the virus, i.e. poison, always in a state of purity in a medium of chicken broth from diseased chickens. He would then use this to inoculate healthy chickens and cause disease. In his 1880 paper Sur les maladies virulentes et en particulier sur la maladie appelée vulgairement, Pasteur laid out his hypothesis on how he felt that the disease spreads. After unsuccessful attempts to make guinea pigs sick, utilizing the cultured organism, he assumed that guinea pigs could become infected but were essentially immune, besides the formation of abscesses. He assumed that the pus in abscesses left after injection contained the microbe responsible for the disease in a pure state. Pasteur then hypothesized that these pustules would burst open and spill the bacterial contents onto the food of the chicken and rabbits, contaminating them and causing disease. Quote, inoculation of this organism to guinea pigs is far from bringing death, as surely as with hens. In guinea pigs, especially of a certain age, we do not observe that a local lesion at the point of inoculation, which ends in a more or less large abscess, after opening spontaneously, the abscess closes and heals without the animal having stopped eating and to have all the appearances of health. Chickens or rabbits that would live in company of guinea pigs with such abscesses could suddenly become ill and perish without the health of the guinea pigs appearing less altered in the world. For this, it would be enough for the abscesses of the guinea pigs having just opened spill a little of their contents on chicken and rabbit feed. An observer, witness to these facts and ignoring the filiation of which I speak, would be in astonishment to see chickens and rabbits decimated without apparent causes, and would believe in the spontaneity of evil, because it would be far from supposing that it took its origin in guinea pigs, all healthy, especially if he knew that guinea pigs are also subject to the same affection. End quote. Clearly, Pasteur's hypothesized exposure route of contaminated food covered in guinea pig pustules was not based upon any observed natural phenomenon. It was an idea that he conjured up after his failed attempts to make guinea pigs sick. There was no attempt to recreate his hypothetical scenario in Pasteur's 1880 paper, The Attenuation of the Causal Agent of Fowl Cholera. There is also no mention as to the exact details of his culturing methods or how the chickens were actually inoculated in order to recreate his presumed exposure route. While there are sources that claim that he fed the chickens the bacterium, others say that the chickens were injected. The only mention of the chickens being fed anything that I could find came from a paper that Pasteur published in 1881 titled On Chicken Cholera, Study of the Conditions of Non-Recidivation and of Some Other Characteristics of this Disease. In it, Pasteur claimed that he imitated how the disease occurs naturally in poultry yards by feeding the chickens the muscles of diseased chickens in his attempts to demonstrate the effectiveness of vaccination. Quote, as to the introduction of the parasite in the digestive organs, I have imitated the epidemics which depopulate poultry yards by introducing the parasite in the food of the chickens. Every day I gave to these 24 chickens a meal of the diseased muscles of chickens who had died from chicken cholera." End quote. However, when discussing how he studied the disease for vaccination, Pasteur stated that he injected his cultured poison into the pectoral muscles and thighs of chickens. Quote, "I inoculate them in their pectoral muscles, or still better, in the muscle of the thigh, so as to observe with greater ease the effect of the inoculation." End quote. His use of injections to prove the microbe as the causative agent was admitted by Pasteur in his 1881 address, an address on vaccination in relation to chicken cholera and splenic fever, where he claimed that he injected the blood and cultured broth of infected chickens into the skin of healthy chickens. Quote, "Let us take one of our series of culture preparations, the 100th or the 1000th, for instance, and compare it in respect to virulence with the blood of a fowl which has died of cholera. In other words, let us inoculate under the skin 10 fowls, for instance, each separately with a tiny drop of infectious blood, and 10 others with a similar quantity of the liquid in which the deposit has first been shaken up. Strange to say, the latter 10 fowls will die as quickly and with the same symptoms as the former 10. The blood of all will be found to contain after death the same minute infectious organisms." End quote. Obviously, feeding chickens diseased muscles from other dead chickens and injecting cultured broth and blood into the pecs, thighs, and skin of healthy chickens are not natural routes of exposure, and thus this recreation of experimental disease would not be reflective of anything that could be observed in nature. These experiments did not line up with Pasteur's hypothesized natural exposure route of the pus of guinea pigs contaminating the feed. Thus, the proposed hypothesis was never tested in any way that could logically confirm or reject it. Instead, Pasteur employed unnatural methods where chickens cannibalized other chickens or were injected with substances in ways that they would not be subjected to in nature, thus invalidating the evidence presented. However, this isn't the most damning revelation. In the 1882 paper Pasteur's Experiments by Rollin Gregg, MD, a fatal flaw was pointed out regarding the assumptions made by Pasteur and other researchers studying chicken cholera and related diseases. They were mistaking coagulated fibrin as living microorganisms. Quote, "This brings us then to one of the most important of all questions for a better and more scientific understanding of this subject, and that is, what are these microbes? Professor Pasteur says they are living organisms, bacteria, or vegetable parasites, and all investigators and writers, not only upon these diseases, but on diphtheria as well, assert the same. But have not all such observers overlooked one ever-present and very important fact in all these and similar cases, and that the fact that in every instance where blood congests as the result of their inoculation, the fibrin in the blood of the animal inoculated commences at once or soon to coagulate, locally at first, and then more or less throughout the whole system, into minute granules as the result of the poison introduced, and that these minute granules of fibrin have been mistaken by them for living organisms or vegetable parasites?" End quote. Dr. Gregg went on to say that these fibrin particles appear indistinguishable from the forms of bacteria that had been discovered at the time, and that injecting coagulated fibrin into healthy chickens causes the same coagulation to occur within them, leading to disease. Quote, "Again, it should be borne in mind that the molecular granules, the fibrils and spirals of coagulating fibrin are, in their very appearance and under all circumstances, precisely Like the three classified forms of bacteria, spherical, rod-like, and spiral, the microscope has never pointed out the slightest distinction between them, and that they occupy the same positions and demean themselves in precisely the same manner wherever found. Therefore, if Professor Pasteur will repeat his highly important experiments recently reported in London, and while doing so, keep well in view the foregoing facts, he will no doubt be led to revise his conclusions from seeing that his microbes or bacteria of chicken cholera and of splenic fever are simply coagulated particles of fibrin in the blood of the diseased animals, and that those caused in healthy animals by their inoculation with such blood are also nothing but coagulating particles of the fibrin of their blood, the coagulation thereof being simply induced in the healthy animal by like matter, coagulated fibrin, in the diseased animal's blood introduced by the inoculation. End quote. Dr. Gregg then criticized Pasteur for assuming and asserting the presence of unnatural elements within the blood without proof, while ignoring a natural element in fibrin that can be proven easily. He then challenged Pasteur to prove his burden of an unnatural element, or the natural explanation should take its place. Quote, he assumes and asserts the presence of an unnatural and foreign element, vegetable, organism in the blood, etc., without clear proof that they are such, while we can positively assert and prove the actual presence of a normal element, fibrin, there, but morbidly changed, that is, coagulated into minute particles by the inoculating poison or by the inflammation which that excites. Therefore, I repeat, the burden of proof lies wholly with him to make good his unnatural claim, or the natural fact must and should take its place. End quote. Based upon Dr. Gregg's account, we can see that it was a misinterpretation of what Pasteur witnessed within the blood, as well as the unnatural experimental mode of injection that led to disease. This had absolutely nothing to do with how a chicken would acquire the disease in nature or Pasteur's hypothesized natural exposure route. Thus, Pasteur's experiments failed as an explanation of an observed relationship of a natural phenomenon. Ironically, even Robert Koch rejected some of Pasteur's experiments as worthless and naive, particularly ridiculing his work with chicken cholera. Regardless, based upon his experimental evidence with the bacterium, Pasteur was eventually credited with creating an attenuated vaccine for chicken cholera in 1880, which some consider as the birth of immunology. However, there is controversy over how this came about, as legend has it, as told by Pasteur's most trusted partner, Émile Duclos, and recounted in his semi-autobiography written by his son-in-law, René Valéry Radot, a virulent culture of Pasteurella that killed injected hens was forgotten about by an assistant and left on the bench during Pasteur's vacation in the summer of 1879. Upon his return, Pasteur used this old bacterial culture to inject the hens and was surprised to find that it failed to kill them. He then prepared a fresh, virulent culture and injected it into the same hens, which did not result in the death of the hens as expected. From that observation, Pasteur assumed that the bacterium, when exposed to the air, lost its virulence, allowing for it to be used as a vaccine. He would go on to state, quote, in the fields of observation, chance favors only prepared minds. In other words, the creation of the vaccine was a happy coincidence. Interestingly, Pasteur would not go on to reveal the methods for how he was able to develop his vaccine until late October of 1880, 9 months after he had announced his successful creation of the vaccine. According to Gaisson, at that time, Pasteur provided no explanation as to why exactly oxygen should weaken microbes, especially the aerobic microbes that depended on it for life. Perhaps this delay in explaining this vaccine is due to the fact that when he made his announcement, it was still an inconclusive program of research, and the means had not yet been fully established through decisive experiments. In other words, Pasteur simply had no explanation, and the story concocted at a later date was nothing but pure fiction. To support this contention, in 1878, Pasteur instructed his son-in-law to never allow his lab notebooks to be released to the public. However, Nearly 100 years later, in 1964, his grandson, Professor Louis Pasteur Valéry Radot, donated all 152 notebooks to the French National Library. This allowed historians such as Gerald Gayson to comb over Pasteur's work, and upon doing so, it was revealed that within his notebooks there was no text between July 1879 and November 1879 mentioning this fortunate event that resulted in the attenuation of the culture. However, on January 14, 1880, Pasteur wrote in his lab book, "Hen's germs. When should we take the microbe so it could vaccinate?" He would go on to announce the discovery of the vaccine in February of 1880. This was a clear admission that Pasteur had no understanding of the vaccine when he was said to have performed the experiments the year prior. Pasteur had lied about the events leading up to the creation of the vaccine. While he is still given credit for proving the causative agent and for demonstrating the effectiveness of the vaccine, even Pasteur noted in his 1881 paper that, as the result of many experiments, quote, "the effects of vaccination are very variable and that vaccines rarely act as a complete preventative." Nearly 100 years later, in the 1959 paper Studies on Control of Fowl Cholera, we find out that the effects weren't just variable, but that vaccination was ineffective against the disease and that it provided no protection to the vaccinated flock, making it an unreliable method to control disease. Quote, "Although Pasteur in 1880 demonstrated immunity in fowls inoculated with attenuated cultures of P. mortosida, workers since that time have had irregular results with various vaccines and bacterins. Generally, no protection was provided in the vaccinated fowls, or the resulting immunity was of a low level and of short duration. Immunization has never been accepted as a dependable control measure for fowl cholera." End quote. Thus, from Pasteur's first attempt to prove his germ hypothesis, the experiment did not reflect his hypothesis as to how the disease spreads. The agent used may have been nothing more than normal coagulated fibrin. The route of exposure of feeding chickens diseased muscles and or injecting the blood of diseased chickens into healthy ones was not a natural exposure route. The act of injecting coagulated fibrin into healthy animal can cause disease. The vaccine used as proof of his success in identifying the causative agent was ineffective and unsuccessful despite claims stating otherwise. Finally, Pasteur fabricated the account of how the attenuated vaccine came to be created. I'm going to skip the rabies part because I already covered it in a different article. As discussed, the purpose of the hypothesis is to propose an explanation for an observed natural phenomenon that can be tested and confirmed through experimentation in order to gain knowledge about natural events or processes that occur within nature. The experiments and evidence generated to support said hypothesis should reflect the observed natural phenomenon. In no way did Louis Pasteur provide any evidence that could be said to be close to achieving this. To prove his hypothesis, Pasteur fed chickens the remains of diseased chickens, injected animals with coagulated substances into the muscles and skin, and drilled holes into the heads of dogs and injected them with diseased brain and nervous system matter. None of these methods of exposure reflect any event or process that was observed in nature. Why did Pasteur have to resort to such grotesque methods in order to create experimental disease if his hypothesis was correct that the natural exposure to germs themselves were the cause of the disease? It is because exposure to microbes through a natural route, either aerosolized or with pure cultures applied to their regular feed, did not produce disease. Thus, unnatural and invasive methods that did not reflect nature had to be substituted in place until the desired results were created. Therefore, the actual proposed hypotheses for how the diseases were said to occur in nature were falsified by the repeated failures to recreate the disease naturally in said matter. Based upon the work of Louis Pasteur, the germ hypothesis was disproven from the very beginning, and it should never have been elevated to the status of a scientific theory. Regardless, the work of Pasteur's contemporary and bitter rival, the German bacteriologist Robert Koch, ultimately provided a lifeline to Pasteur's disproven germ hypothesis. As Koch's work was instrumental in elevating the falsified hypothesis to its status as a scientific theory, we will examine his contributions in part 2. We will explore whether Koch's experimental results, combined with his revolutionary methods and logical postulates, were enough to overcome the fatal flaws of Pasteur. And that is Mike Stone from mikestone.substack.com. And that's our show. I'll do part 2 tomorrow. We need to learn about Koch. You've heard of Koch's postulates, right? Very important stuff. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Please go to tulipblooms.shop, where you can get a very special deal on the Serum Trio, the amazing castor blend. 40% castor oil, but then 10% argan oil, 10% apricot kernel oil, 10% amaranth oil, and then 1.5 to 2% ish sea buckthorn fruit oil from the beautiful mountainside of the Himalayas, all of it performing amazing things on your skin. And then the Morning Dew Refreshing Serum and the Vitamin C Nighttime Serum, all three together, nice big fat discount. Buy them all three in a youthful serum pack. TulipBlooms.shop. Use promo code Shapiro for an extra 10% off. Go there today. Support what I do here at Reading Epic Threads. Also, make sure to check out dellingpole.substack.com. Make sure to check out mikestone.substack.com. And with Mike Stone, if you can, make sure to let him know that I sent you. I think there's a way to do it within Substack. I'm not looking at it all that carefully, but yeah, check it out. In any event, fun times, great show, great audience. Let us pray. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. I love you all. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you tomorrow.
I will be the greatest president that God ever created.